I want you to picture something for a second. Have
Yeah.
you ever been in a situation, maybe it's at the office, or I don't know, maybe within your own family or a community group, where you see a dynamic playing out that is just objectively wrong?
Oh, yeah. I think we've all been there.
Right. And the moment you see it, you feel this massive, overwhelming urge to step in, take control, and just fix it yourself, like immediately.
Yeah, you don't want to form a committee. You definitely don't want to wait for the system to,
Yeah.
correct itself.
Exactly. You just want to act. You want to be the one to force a resolution right then and there.
It's that sudden rush of adrenaline, right?
Mm.
Mixed with this deep moral outrage. There is this absolute, unshakable certainty that if you don't do something right this very second, the entire situation is going to fall apart, and it will be on your conscience.
Yeah, and that very specific, deeply human impulse is exactly what we are unpacking in today's deep dive. We are exploring a truly fascinating psychological and theological text today.
It really is a brilliant source to dig into.
It is. We are looking at a sermon that takes a magnifying glass to one of the most famous figures in all of history, Moses. But the sermon doesn't focus on, the cinematic moments.
Right, no Charlton Heston moments here.
Exactly. We aren't talking about the parting of the Red Sea or carrying the Ten Commandments down the mountain. Instead, the focus is zeroed in on his biggest, most catastrophic early failure.
Which I love, by the way. Focusing on his failure is such a brilliant angle because it strips away all that mythology of the man. It makes him incredibly relatable to anyone listening who has ever let their ambition or their frustration get the better of them.
So true. And the mission of this deep dive is to explore what actually happens when our desire for justice outpaces our patience. We are going to look at how trying to accomplish genuinely good things in the wrong way can completely derail our lives.
But also, and I think this is the hopeful part, we'll explore how our worst, most spectacular failures might actually be the exact preparation we need for something much bigger.
Right, the setup for the comeback. The sermon we are analyzing today uses the biblical narrative of Moses, specifically in Exodus chapter 2, to illustrate this profound human tendency.
To fully grasp the weight of this narrative, though, we first have to establish the context of what is happening before Moses even makes a move.
Yeah, set the scene for us.
Well, if you look at the beginning of the Exodus story, there is an intense, brutal suffering happening. I mean, the Hebrew people are facing attempted genocide.
It's horrific.
It is. Yet the narrative shows God working very quietly, almost invisibly, behind the scenes. There is this quiet providence at play. A deliverer, Moses, is preserved as a baby.
He's put in the basket.
Right. He is hidden, rescued from the Nile River, and through a stroke of supreme irony, raised right under Pharaoh's nose,
Yeah.
inside Pharaoh's own palace.
I mean, he is the ultimate inside man. He has access, he has this elite education, and he has a front row seat to the empire.
Exactly. And the tension in the text builds because, eventually, Moses steps onto the stage as a grown adult. He steps outside his bubble of privilege. He witnesses the terrible injustice his people are facing firsthand. And instead of waiting on that quiet, behind-the-scenes providence that saved him as an infant, Moses decides to take matters entirely into his own hands.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because
Yeah.
to really understand the depth of the mistake Moses makes, we actually have to start by defending his initial impulse.
Which the sermon does really well.
Yeah, it would be really easy to just paint him as a reckless vigilante from the jump. But the sermon makes a point to highlight a critical identity shift that happens first. We are moving from the background of his intense privilege to the specific moment he steps out of that protective bubble.
What's fascinating here is a tiny, easily overlooked detail in the text. The sermon points out the phrase where it says, Moses went out to his people.
Ah, yeah.
That is not just a geographic change. He didn't just decide to go for a stroll outside the palace gates to get some fresh air. That represents a massive shift in his core identity.
Because he had every reason, at least from a self-preservation standpoint, to just stay inside. I mean, he has an elite education, military training, immense wealth, security.
Oh, Adam May.
He totally did. If anyone had a perfectly rational reason to distance himself from a population of enslaved laborers, it was Moses. But the sermon references the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, which confirms this was a deliberate choice. He refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated with the people of God.
And the sermon emphasizes that the text says he looked on their burdens. The word looked in the original language It carries a heavy, empathetic weight.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just a casual glance?
Right. He didn't just glance at the suffering from a chariot as he rode by. He absorbed it. He felt the crushing reality of their oppression. He didn't turn away in apathy. He stepped directly toward the pain.
Which brings us to the inciting incident. Moses is out there. He is feeling the weight of this oppression, and he sees an Egyptian brutally beating a Hebrew.
And he snaps.
His moral instinct instantly kicks in. He strikes down the Egyptian, kills him, and hides his body in the sand. Now, it's easy to judge Moses here from the comfort of our modern armchairs, but honestly, I look at that and think, isn't his zeal kind of commendable?
I mean, yeah, you can definitely see where he's coming from.
To use a modern equivalent, it's like a corporate whistleblower who suddenly uncovers massive, life-ruining fraud that is destroying people's pensions. You want that person to step up and stop the bleeding. You don't want them to just nod sympathetically, file a memo, and walk away.
For sure. And the sermon completely validates the core of that perspective. The concern for justice isn't the problem at all. Refusing to ignore suffering is a virtue.
Right.
The sermon brings in a quote from the theologian John Calvin, who framed the dynamic perfectly. He said Moses' zeal was good, but it was not governed rightly.
Wow.
Yeah, the cause was fundamentally right, but the method was fundamentally wrong.
Hold on, I have to push back here.
Sure, go for it.
If God is working quietly behind the scenes, like you mentioned earlier, isn't it entirely logical for Moses to assume that the guy with the palace training and the newfound empathy is the instrument God wants to use? Why is it a flaw for him to take action? Isn't doing something always better than doing nothing?
That is the exact trap Moses falls into.
Yeah.
And honestly, it is a trap we all fall into. A right desire does not justify a rogue method.
Okay, that's a good point.
There is a brilliant textual clue in the narrative that reveals exactly where Moses crosses the line from divine instrument to self-appointed vigilante. Right before he strikes the Egyptian, the text says Moses looked this way and that.
He was checking his blind spots.
Exactly. He was scanning the perimeter for witnesses. And that one physical action reveals everything about his internal spiritual state.
Because he knew he was doing something shady.
Right. He wasn't pausing to seek God. He wasn't praying like, Lord, what is commanded here? What is your will for this moment? He was just checking to see if he could get away with it. In that split second, he removes God from the equation entirely and installs himself as judge, jury, and executioner.
Man, that's powerful. The act of looking over your shoulder proves you know you are operating outside the proper parameters. He is relying entirely on his own instincts, his own physical strength, and his own timing.
100%.
And rushing ahead like that, trying to force a righteous outcome through compromise means it doesn't just result in one isolated bad action, it triggers a massive cascade of unintended consequences. We shift now from the secret act of violence to the immediate chaotic backlash.
Because once you step outside of the right parameters, you forfeit the ability to control the fallout. That illusion of control shatters almost instantly.
Let's look at how quickly that unravels. Moses goes out the very next day. He probably wakes up feeling a mix of adrenaline, anxiety, maybe a little pride, like he took a stand.
Right, he thinks he's the hero.
He goes back out and sees two Hebrews fighting each other. He tries to intervene again, but the dynamic has shifted. Yesterday, he used lethal physical force. Today, he tries to use moral authority. He asks the man who is in the wrong why he is striking his companion.
And the response he gets is just a brutal emotional whiplash.
Oh, it's so bad.
The man looks at Moses and says, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?"
It's incredible. The sermon actually references Acts chapter 7, verse 25, which provides a fascinating psychological insight into Moses' mindset leading up to this exact moment.
Oh, what does it say?
It says, Moses assumed he fully expected that his brothers would understand that God was using his hand to bring them salvation. We are talking about a classic savior complex. Moses expects a parade.
Wow. Yeah, he really thought they'd just fall in line.
He totally did. He expects the Hebrews to recognize his sacrifice, see his power, and hail him as their liberator. Instead, they throw his hypocrisy right back in his face.
Put yourself in his shoes to feel the psychological devastation of that single interaction. I mean, he blew up his entire life to step in and help them, and he is met with deep suspicion, hostility, and immediate rejection.
He must have felt so betrayed.
And terrified. The secret of the murder is out, and his leverage is completely gone. The text notes that as soon as Pharaoh heard about the murder, he sought to kill Moses.
So his palace protection is gone.
Exactly. So in the blink of an eye, Moses loses his status, his wealth, his influence, and his safety. He becomes a terrified, hunted fugitive fleeing for his life.
But the sermon doesn't just leave this as a cautionary tale about cause and effect consequences, right? It points out a much deeper theological motif running beneath the surface of this rejection.
It does. And this raises an important question. Why does God allow the very people Moses is trying to save to be the ones who expose and reject him?
Right. Why not just let the plan work?
Well, there is a consistent pattern throughout historical and biblical texts where God's chosen servants are almost always violently rejected before they are finally received.
Oh, like who?
The sermon connects the dots to several major figures. Look at Joseph. He was rejected, thrown in a pit, and sold by his own brothers long before he ever rose to power to save them from famine. Look at King David. He was hunted in the wilderness as a fugitive by the very establishment he was anointed to lead.
Yeah, and the prophets were routinely ignored, mocked, and killed by the people they were trying to warn.
Exactly. And ultimately, the sermon connects this pattern of rejection to Christ. It quotes the Gospel of John, saying, "He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him."
Wow, the parallels are pretty striking.
They really are. Moses steps in to deliver his people, and he is rejected. Jesus comes to deliver humanity and is rejected. Now, the sermon makes a very careful distinction here.
Okay, what is it?
Moses' suffering is deeply tangled up in his own sinful, rash, violent action. He is not an innocent victim of circumstance here. But the overarching point is that God does not waste this painful rejection. God uses this exposure to completely shatter Moses' dangerous assumptions about how deliverance is supposed to work.
Which brings us to the core issue beneath the action itself. We are moving from the visible scene of the crime to the invisible posture of Moses' heart. The sermon calls this the theology of the hands.
I love that phrase.
Me too. The physical actions of Moses striking the Egyptian and then hiding the body reveal a massive, deep-seated illusion of self-reliance.
Let's focus intensely on that phrase for a second. He hid him in the sand.
To me, hiding the body in the sand proves that Moses, intuitively, on some subconscious level, knew that what he was doing wasn't quite right. You don't bring about true justice and national deliverance through secret violence and desert cover-ups.
No, you definitely don't.
It reminds me of a modern politician desperately trying to bury a scandal. They think if they can just manage the physical evidence, if they can just, control the optics, they can control the narrative, completely ignoring the moral rot underneath. Moses was trying to engineer an outcome.
He really was. He was trying to accomplish God's purposes without God's direction. That is the true crux of his failure. As the sermon highlights, there was no pausing to seek divine guidance.
Zero.
Moses possessed incredible zeal, he possessed physical courage, and he possessed a genuine sense of moral justice, but none of it was submitted to a higher authority. It was just Moses, his ego, and his own two hands.
Yeah, that's a dangerous combination.
It is. The sermon brings in a powerful quote from the book of Zechariah, chapter 4, verse 6. It says, "Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit."
But wait, isn't God pragmatic? I mean, if the goal is freeing slaves and Moses has the military training to start a rebellion, why does the method matter so much? Why couldn't God just use Moses' strength?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sermon draws an absolutely stunning contrast to answer that exact question.
Yeah.
God's economy of redemption does not rely on human force.
How so?
Look at the contrast the sermon draws between Moses and Christ. Moses uses his hands to forcefully strike down an enemy and take a life, relying entirely on his own human strength. Christ, on the other hand, stretches out his hands to be struck, willingly giving his life.
Oh, wow. That is a completely different approach.
Night and day, Moses acts in aggressive self-assertion. Christ acts in perfect, quiet submission to the Father's will. Human strength cannot accomplish divine redemption.
So what does this all mean, especially for you listening right now? The sermon brings this ancient story right to our modern front doors. Think about your own life. How often do you try to force outcomes?
Ouch, yeah.
How often do you assume that just because your goal is noble, maybe you're trying to fix a broken dynamic in your family, or you are trying to push through a necessary structural change at work, that your self-reliant, bulldoze your way through methods are entirely justified?
We all do it.
We do. But the hard, uncomfortable truth this text presents is that God is not honored by our self-reliance, even when we dress it up in the costume of righteousness.
And the thing is, we love our self-reliance.
Mm-hmm.
We reward it in our culture. We call it being a go-getter, right? Or a disruptor.
A self-start.
Yes. But as long as Moses believes that the deliverance of an entire nation depends on his own cleverness, his own physical strength, and his own timeline, he is fundamentally unready to be used for the task. His ego is occupying the space that belongs to God.
Which means his ego has to be systematically dismantled.
Yep.
Once Moses reaches the absolute end of his own strength, once his grand, self-directed plan collapses in spectacular fashion, there is only one place left for him to go away. We move now from the violent scene of the crime in Egypt to the total, crushing isolation of the wilderness, the flight to Midian.
The text notes that Moses fled. He didn't put up a resistance, he didn't try to argue his case, mount a legal defense, or rally the Hebrews to his side.
He knew it was over.
He just ran. He'd been completely exposed and he had absolutely nothing left to leverage. But the profound twist the sermon offers is this: what looks strictly like a desperate geographic escape from a death sentence is actually the beginning of divine providence. It is a necessary, albeit painful, preparation.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When you look at the timeline of Moses' life, it is just staggering. Moses lived as a prince, basking in the luxury, education, and power of Egypt for 40 years. 4 decades.
A lifetime for most people back then.
Exactly. And then he spends the next 40 years as a fugitive and a shepherd in the desolate, forgotten wilderness of Midian. The pastor in the sermon uses this incredible framing. He says, Moses spent 40 years thinking he was somebody, 40 years learning he was nobody, and 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody.
The symmetry of that timeline is profound. God wasn't just putting Moses in a cosmic timeout for murder.
Right. It wasn't just a punishment.
It wasn't just parking him in the desert until the heat died down in Egypt. God was preparing Moses to become someone entirely different. He had to become a shepherd.
Let's talk about the psychology of that isolation. You cannot learn to be a shepherd while living in a palace. You go from having servants anticipate your every need, from commanding armies to spending day after day, year after year, in absolute silence, talking to sheep.
And sheep aren't exactly great conversationalists.
No, they are not.
The skills required to shepherd a flock, immense patience, quiet vigilance, guiding stubborn animals without killing them, and existing in deep, obscure dependence on the environment, these are the exact opposite of the skills you learn as royalty.
Because in the palace, you just lead by decree.
Exactly. You speak, and it happens. The wilderness strips that delusion of control away entirely. All of Moses' previous identity, markers, his royal title, his wealth, his influence, his network, they're gone. The isolation breaks his ego.
So that decades later, when God finally speaks to him from the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3 and officially calls him to lead the Exodus, Moses doesn't puff out his chest.
Right.
He doesn't say, finally, I knew you'd realize you needed my skill set, let's go.
His response is the complete inverse of his attitude as a young man. At the burning bush, he shrinks back and says, "Who am I?"
Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?
Yeah. He is a fundamentally transformed human being. The 40 years of silence did their work. He has been completely emptied of his self-reliance. He now realizes how incapable he is in his own strength, which makes him the perfect vessel for God's strength.
Imagine listening to this right now and realizing you might be squarely in a Midian phase of your own life.
Oh, that's a tough realization.
It is. Maybe things did not go as planned. Maybe you stepped out to do something you thought was good and it blew up in your face. Now you feel surrounded by detours, professional failures, or just a crushing sense of obscurity where no one sees your potential.
And you just feel stuck.
Right.
Yeah.
But the argument of this sermon is that this obscurity is not the end of your story. You are not just wasting away in the desert. You are in the workshop.
Midian is the furnace where God forges the instrument he's going to use. The initial failure was not final. The decades in the wilderness were not meaningless, wasted time. It was the exact, highly specific environment required to shift Moses' trust away from his own two hands and onto God's providence.
It completely reframes how we view our own painful periods of waiting. We usually view waiting as a malfunction of our plans rather than a necessary feature of our growth.
That's a great way to put it.
As we bring this deep dive to a close, the sermon offers a concluding call to action, and it centers around the idea of coming to the table. The sermon summarizes this entire messy, painful journey by saying that even when we rush ahead, even when we take matters completely into our own clumsy hands and try to accomplish in our own strength what only God can do, God does not take his hands off of us.
Wow.
We are invited to come to the table, not trusting in the resume of what our own hands have built or achieved or forced into existence, but resting entirely in what Christ's hands have already finished.
It requires a massive spiritual shift from frantic, anxious doing to peaceful resting. It requires letting go of our endless attempts at self-justification and instead relying on a better deliverer, one who triumphed not through asserting his human strength, but through the ultimate submissive weakness of the cross.
Absolutely. Before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, building on the depths of everything we've explored today. Think about that 40-year timeline we discussed.
Yeah.
Moses required 4 full decades of absolute obscurity in the wilderness to unlearn his self-reliance and become the leader he needed to be. Contrast that with today. We live in a culture obsessed with life hacks, immediate efficiency, skipping the line, and the immense pressure to land on a 30 under 30 list to prove we've made an impact.
It's exhausting.
It really is. So how does our modern allergy to waiting actively prevent us from developing the kind of deep dependence and resilient character required for true, lasting leadership? Are we constantly trying to skip the wilderness workshop, and in doing so, short-circuiting our own preparation?
We treat obscurity like a disease, but this text suggests that the slow, hidden process might be the only process that actually produces lasting change.
It's definitely something to chew on the next time you feel that overwhelming, adrenaline-fueled urge to just step in and fix everything immediately. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Moses, the Wilderness Workshop, and the theology of our hands. We encourage you to embrace the slow, sometimes painful process of being shaped rather than rushing ahead to force an outcome. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.